In this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know about React Router, and as you can see by this massive list of notes, I've taken extensive notes on everything you need to know, compiled it down into this one video so you can learn everything you need to know about React Router in less than an hour. I'm going to be breaking this up into 3 distinct sections. The first section is going to be all about what you need to know to get started with React Router and just the basics of how to use it. Then we're going to talk secondly about how all of the different routing in React Router works. And finally, the third section is going to be about how you navigate between all your different routes in React Router. With that said, let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And today we're talking all about React Router. Now, in order to use React Router, you first need to install it. So if you just type in npm i React Router DOM, that's going to install the DOM version of React Router. There's 2 different versions of React Router. There's the DOM version and then the React Native version. So if you're working with React Native, you need to use React Router Native instead of React Router DOM. And most things are going to be the same between the 2 versions. Just make sure you install the right one. Once you have that installed, there's a couple steps you need to go through in order to use React Router. First, you need to go to your index.js and you need to wrap your entire application inside of the router of your choice. And in our case, since we're in the browser, we're going to be using the browser router. So we're going to come in here and we're going to import from that React Router DOM library, and we want to import the browser router. And this browser router is essentially a React context. Now, if you're unfamiliar with React context, I have a full free React hooks course that covers context. I'll link in the description for you. But essentially, we just need to wrap our entire application inside of this component. And this component is going to provide a bunch of information related to routing to all of the other components in our application, which will make everything work seamlessly. So there we go. We have our router set up. Now we need to define the routes for our application. Currently in this application, I just have a bunch of placeholder pages, and they're all pretty much empty. They just have an H1 that says the name of the page so that we can really easily see what's going on. Super basic code. So in order to set up our routes between these pages, I'm going to go into my app component here, and I'm going to use a component called routes. This routes component comes directly from React Router DOM, and inside of this routes component, we need to use another component called route to define all of our routes. So we have this routes component with an S at the end that wraps all of our individual route components, which each define a path to a different page in our website. So for example, if we have a home page and we have a book list page, those would be 2 separate routes. So we would need to have 2 route elements inside of our page. So let's come in here with 2 route elements, and that's how we're going to define our different routes. Now, each one of these routes, they need to have an actual path that you go to. So we're going to pass it a path, and this is like the URL that defines this location. So our index path right here will just have a single slash because we're saying, hey, this is our root path of our application. And then we need to define the component for that application. So that is what the element is for. And in the element, you just pass it any type of JSX you want. So we're going to go to the home component here. So I'm going to say that this is our home component. I'm just going to close all that off. So now what I've done is I've defined this individual route right here for our index path, our root path, and this is going to our home component. And as you can see, since we are currently at that path right now, it's rendering out the text home on the side of my screen. Now I need to do the exact same thing for another path, and this path is going to be for viewing our books. So it's going to be at /books, and we're going to render out the book list component. So let's just make sure we import that book list up here. And now if I save, you'll notice nothing actually changes, and that's because the way React Router works is when you enter this routes component, it's going to find the route that matches whatever route you're on. Our route that matches is this one, so it's going to render out the home component. Now if I change my URL here to go to that /books route, you can now see it's rendering out that book list component onto our page because we're at this books route, so it's rendering out the element associated with that. And this element can be anything you want. I could change this to like an H1 here that just says hi inside of it. And now I save, and you can see it just renders out the text hi. So whatever is inside of this element is what gets rendered out to your page when your component or when your URL matches this path. Now, obviously, you don't want to have to manually type in different URLs to change pages. So we're going to add some navigation into our application. And to do that with React Router, you need to use link components. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's wrap all of this inside of a fragment so we can render multiple things. And I'm just going to render a really simple nav bar at the top of our screen. And we're going to put this inside of an unordered list. And each one of these is going to have an li, which is going to have an anchor tag inside of it. But instead of an anchor tag like you would normally have, you're going to use this link component. And the link component essentially replaces all of the anchor tags in your application because instead of using an anchor tag to do all the redirecting, we're using this link component. And this link component is technically an anchor tag underneath. So if we just say that this is going to go to the home page, It's technically an anchor tag, but it's going to be used within React Router to automatically swap things out in your application without refreshing your entire application. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a second. But instead of using an href like you would normally use, you just need to use the to attribute that replaces your href. So this is going to go to the index page, just slash like that. I'm going to create another brand new link. This one's going to be for our books, and this one is going to go to the slash books route. So now if I save, you can see at the top of my page, I have those two links that I just created inside of our nav, as well as our content down here. And when I click on this books link, you'll notice something really interesting. This bottom half of my page changes to say book list, but my entire page doesn't refresh. It only changes the content inside of this route section. All of this content out here does not change. My component doesn't re-render. None of that stuff has to change. The only stuff that has to change is inside of here. And this is really nice because now all your navigation is super quick because you don't have to refresh your entire page every time. You only have to change the things that actually change inside of this routes component. Now that right there is the bare bones basics of how you can use React Router. You need to first import your router into your index.js page. You need to define all your routes inside of this routes component, and then you use different link tags to move around your application to all of these different routes. But there's obviously a lot more you can do than just these bare bone basics. And the first thing I want to talk about is the different type of routers you can use, because a browser router is not the only router that you have available. There's another router that you have available called the hash router. Now the hash router is very similar to the browser router in that it works inside your browser, but instead of storing the URL as a normal URL, it stores it inside of the hashed portion of our URL. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If I click on books here, you can see in my URL, instead of being at /books, we're at this hashtag /books. So all of this is considered a hash. It's not actually part of the URL. Anytime you see this like hashtag symbol, everything that comes after it is not technically your actual URL. Our URL is still localhost 3000. And then we're just storing everything related to the URL we're at inside this hash. Now, 99% of the time, you don't want this, and you should just use the normal browser router, but this can be really useful if you're working on like a shared server where you can't actually change the URL of your website. It always has to be the same. In those scenarios, then this could be a useful situation, but again, 99% of the time, just don't use this. Now, another type of router I want to talk about is called the history router, and this is actually underneath the name unstable history router. And the way this history router works is it allows you to actually take control completely of the history element in React Router. So the history element just determines how your entire browser renders out the history of all the pages you've been on. So for example, when I click the back button, it properly sends me backwards. When I click the forward button, it properly sends me forward. That is considered like your browser history. And what this router allows you to do is have direct access to that browser history and be able to manipulate it as you need. Now again, this is something 99.9% of the time you don't need, so again, I don't recommend using it, and it's currently unstable because they have some issues with this history object being duplicated, so again, I just recommend you do not use this. Now the other three types of routers I want to talk about have very specific niche use cases that you're most likely not going to run into in the browser, but you are going to run into them when you try to do other things. So the first one I want to talk about is the memory router. Now the memory router is different than all the other routers in that it actually stores everything related to where you've been in history inside of memory, and it doesn't rely on the URL bar of our browser. So you can see when I click on these pages, my URL up here never changes. And this reasoning is it's just stored inside of the memory of my web page. It's not stored anywhere else at all. Now you may think this is useless because, changing pages should change the URL, but the reason that this is useful is if you need to run tests on your code. If you want to test your React Router code or any of your routing code, obviously it's much better to use a router that works in memory instead of relying on being connected to a browser, because if you're not connected to a browser, the browser router is going to break and not work. So the memory router is really good when you're running tests that don't actually connect to the browser. That's pretty much the only use case for it. Now another router that has a very specific use case is going to be the static router, and this router is specifically for working on the server. So if I do React Router /server down here, I can import this static router, and the static router is different than all the other routers in that it doesn't actually allow you to change pages. It specifies a single URL, and you do that by specifying a location. So I could say my location here is like /books, for example. And now when I save, and I just give my page a refresh here real quick, you can see it's rendering out the books page. If I remove this /books, it's going to render out the home page. And the reason you would want to use this static router is if you render your components on a server in React, well, you need to make sure that all your components render the correct page. So this static router just allows you to tell React what page you're currently rendering. You're saying, I'm rendering the home page, and then render out my app inside that home page. That's the only reason you would ever use the static router is on the server. So if you're not doing server-side rendering, just pretend this doesn't even exist. Now the last type of router there is the native router. It's just like this. But I don't actually have access to the native router because you would need to install the React Router native library to use it. And again, the only reason to use this router is if you're using React Native. If you're not using React Native, then obviously this router is useless. So I'm going to switch everything back to the browser router, which in 99.9% of the situations you work in, this is going to be the router you use unless you're doing server rendering or testing. So now with all of the routers out of the way, let's move back into our app.js and we're going to talk about all the different ways you can write out this routes section of your page because you can really fine tune this and make it really nice. So let's say, for example, we want to add some additional routes into our application for rendering out our books. As you can see, we have this book page and we want to be able to render out multiple different books. Like let's say there's 10 different books with 10 different unique IDs. We want to be able to render out those books. So we can define a route that has like a custom parameter inside of it, which is going to be dynamic and able to be changed. So this thing that we want to render is going to be /books/:ID. Now, if you've worked with something like Express before on the backend, you'll be really familiar with this concept. But essentially what this does is it says, okay, we have a URL that goes /books/ and then it just has something afterwards. In our case, it's just any ID. So we give this a name of ID, and by giving it this colon in the front, that's how we signify that this is actually not a part of the URL that's hard-coded. Like it's not saying we have to go to /books/:ID. It's saying we're going to /books anything. So it could be like /books1. So if we just put our book right here, and what I do, and I make sure that I import our book, there we go. And if I just go over here to /books/1, that's going to render out the book page. If I go to /books/ASDF, it's going to render out that book page. And this section right here that comes after the books is being stored as our ID inside of this scenario. So I'm going to go to my books page, this book list, and I'm going to add a few links for linking to different books. So instead of having this H1 inside of our book list, we'll have a couple other things as well. So I'm going to use a fragment here, just like that. And then below this, I'm just going to have two links. So we're going to have a link that goes to /book/1, book 1, and I'm going to do the exact same thing for book 2. I believe I called this books instead of book. There we go. So now we can click on book 1, it brings us to book 1, and we click on book 2, it brings us to book 2. But how do we actually know which book we're on? Like, how do we know what this ID portion of our URL is? Because right now we're passing it along, but in our book component, we're not using it. Well, in order to use this inside of React Router, we're going to be using one of the many custom hooks that comes with React Router. We can use the useParams hook, and this useParams hook is very simple. It takes no parameters at all. You just call it like this, and it's going to return to us an object that has all of the custom parameters we defined in our route. So in our case, we defined a parameter called ID. So this is going to return to us an object that has a key of ID, and the value of that ID is going to be whatever is placed in our URL right here. I'm just going to say that we're going to have an ID, and we're going to say book ID, just to print out what that book is. So since we're on ID 2, it's printing out book 2 right here. If we go back to our book list, click on book 1, you can now see it's printing out book 1. So by using this route that has a custom dynamic parameter inside of it, we're able to say, you know what, anything that comes after books, whether it's ID of 1, text ASDF, like I could just type in here ASDF, and you can see now it says book ASDF, whatever. So no matter what comes after that, it's going to replace that with the ID right here, and then we can use our parameters here to access that ID variable. This right here is an incredibly common pattern that you're going to see all over any type of routing library, especially React Router. Now let's say that we want to add another route that's going to come after our books. This route is going to be for creating a new book. So we're going to hard code the route of /new. We're saying it has to be exactly /new, and that's going to go to our new book component. So let's just make sure that up here, we import that new book component, just like that. So now everything should be working. And if we just add a simple link on our book list here to create a new book, we'll just say new book. Now, if we go to our book list, you can see we have our 3 links here, and I'm just going to add a simple line break between these so we can see them a little better. There we go. We have book 1, book 2, and new book. And when I click on new book, you can see it's properly bringing me to that new book page. As you can see, this component just renders out the text new book. But you may be wondering a little bit, if we go back to here, these 2 routes technically both match because this text new right here could also be considered the ID for this route right here. So how does React Router know which one of these routes to use? Well, back before version 6, React Router used to just go top to bottom. So it would check this route, then it would check the next route after that, and so on until it found the first route that matched. So if we were using the old version of React Router, technically what would happen is our page would render something like this, where it would say book and it would use the ID of new. But since we're using version 6 of React Router is smart enough to know that we have a hard-coded URL that has this /new inside of it for books, so it knows that we should probably be using this route instead of using this dynamic route up here, which has a ID variable inside of it. So if you have two routes that technically both match the URL you passed in, React Router is going to do some magic behind the scenes to determine which one it thinks you are most likely to pick. So this means, for example, if you have a dynamic variable versus a hard-coded variable, it's always going to go with the route that is hard-coded because that one is more specific. You can kind of think of it like CSS specificity, but it's specific to this React routing, and they have their own algorithm for figuring this out, and it's pretty much always going to be exactly what you want, which is really nice that it does it all for you, and you don't have to worry about the order of your routes. That doesn't matter at all. Now, the final routing thing I want to talk about before we get into my favorite part about the routing is what happens if you want to have like a 404 page. It's pretty common in a website when you enter in a wrong URL, you want to redirect someone to a 404 page to tell them they hit the wrong URL. Well, in React Router, there's a really easy way to do that. You just need to create a route, and the path for this route just needs to be the star symbol. The star symbol matches literally anything, so that means that this route right here will match literally anything you type into the URL bar. So if none of your other routes match anything, this one is going to be matched every single time. So inside of it, we could just render out an element. For example, we have a not found page. We could just render out that not found page, and I'd make sure up here that I import that not found page. Now, if I just type in a URL that doesn't exist, for example, I just do this, that's a URL that doesn't exist, hit enter, it brings me to that not found page. So no matter what happens if I type in a URL that's bogus, it's going to bring me to that not found page, and all the rest of my URLs are going to work just fine. Now, my favorite part about React Router and how the routes are laid out is you can actually nest routes inside of each other, and it gives you some really powerful tools. One thing you'll notice about our routes here is we have 3 routes that all essentially start with /books, and they're all related to books in some way. So we should try to nest those routes inside of each other. So let me just come in here, I'll comment out this for now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new route, and this route is going to be very similar to our original /books route. So we're just going to say /books, but we're not going to give it any element at all. We're just going to say, you know what, we're going to define multiple routes inside of this one parent route, and all of the routes inside of here are going to start with /books. So if we create a new route, we could have this route have a path here, which is just :ID. And now this route is going to be inside of our /books, and it's going to come with :ID afterwards. Now let's do our element here, which is going to be that book element. And for now, I'm just going to close this off, and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. If we go to /books/1 and I hit enter, you can see it brings me properly to that book page. And that's because it's combining together these two routes. It's combining together my /books with my ID to give me essentially the same route that we had down here where we had /books/ID. So this nesting just makes it really easy for you to combine multiple different routes together because all the routes that start with /books can go inside of this one single route. So we can copy this down for our new route as well, which just says new book. So now if we go to /new, this is going to render out new book. But what happens if we want to render out our original /books element itself? Well, to do that, you don't actually define a path. Instead, you just say that this is your index route, which is a Boolean where you just set it to true. By doing this, you're essentially saying that the route for this route matches exactly whatever the parent is. In our case, our parent is /books. So if we give this the book list component, and I close this off, we can actually get rid of all of this code down here that we had before, and now it's going to work exactly the same as before. This /books route goes to my book list component, and each one of my books have their own component, and then finally we have that new book component as well. Now, if this is all that you could do with nesting, it'd be nice, but it wouldn't be as amazing as it is. And that's because with nesting like this, you can actually create layouts that all of your components inside the parent component share. For example, you see this little list that we have here for like book 1, book 2, new book, this little navigation. Wouldn't it be nice if that navigation was on every single one of our pages? Well, what we could do, there's a few ways to do it. What we could do is we could just copy and paste this code into each one of our components, and that'll work. Or we could create our own custom component that has the navigation and copy and paste into each one of our components. Or what we could do is we could create a single file. We're just going to call this the book layout.js. Export function book layout. And inside of here, we're just going to put that code. I'm going to remove that book list portion, and we're just going to get rid of everything inside of here except for the H1. So if we save, this just goes back to what it was before, pretty straightforward. And inside of this book layout, if I just make sure that we import those links, and I return this code inside of a fragment, there we go. Essentially now my book layout only contains my navigation, and the actual book component or book list component here contains just that single text. So what we can do is we can actually use this layout and have it wrap around all of our components by defining that in our route. In our route here, we can give this parent route an element. So let's just say that we give it the element of book layout, just like that. Now when I save, you'll notice something interesting. Our book layout is being rendered, and it doesn't matter if we go to /books, we go to /book/new, we go to /book/1, it's going to be rendering out this parent layout every single time. This is really powerful, but you'll notice none of my other content is being rendered. I can't see the actual individual books or the new book or the book list. None of that is showing up. So if I want to make that show up, what I need to do inside of my book layout is I need to define a component called outlet. So come in here, just type in outlet. This is a really simple component. You don't need to pass it anything at all. And what this does is it just renders whatever the current route is. So if we go back to our app here, you can see we have our book layout being rendered because that's the parent component. So it renders this book layout, and then wherever the outlet is inside this book layout, which is right here, that's where it's going to paste in whatever this component in the child is. So in our case, the book list or the book. So if I save this, you'll now notice it says book 1. If I go to my books homepage, it says book list. New book, it says new book. And if I go to my homepage, you'll see it doesn't have that second menu, and that's because this homepage is not inside of my /books route, so it does not contain my book layout. This is incredibly powerful. The ability to have these different nested levels of layouts just makes working with React Router really nice, because more often than not, you have some code you want to share between all the components inside of one, route. For example, this books route. You want them all to have this navigation bar at the top. So it's super easy to share that by just putting that inside of our route right here. Something else you could do with these nested routes is, let's say that you had like 3 routes that all were going to share the same layout, but they didn't have the same path. The path was different for all of them. What you could do is you could just leave this path section off and only pass an element. And what that does is it's just going to essentially pretend that this route has no path at all, but it's going to wrap all the children inside this element. So it's not going to apply any extra child relationship paths, but it is going to wrap everything inside of this element, and then all the rest of the paths are going to work just like normal. This is really useful, like I said, if you need to wrap a bunch of components that aren't necessarily related by URL inside of the same exact, layout or navigation bar. In our case, though, the path is needed because these all share the same path. Now, one final thing that I want to mention about this different nesting is that inside of your outlet, you can actually pass it one single variable. This is called the context. And this context works just like a normal React context. Essentially, you can define some values that you pass down to any single component that is inside of this layout route. So we could just say that we want to pass down a value of hello world, just like that. So we're passing down an object that has the key of hello and the string of world as its value. So now inside of any of these pages that are rendered inside this book layout, so our book list, our book, our new book, what we can do is we can come in and we can just say that we want to get that object, and we can say that's equal to use outlet context, and just close that off like this. So this function right here just returns to us whatever we passed to that context property inside of our outlet. This is incredibly useful, again, because a lot of times when you have a shared layout, you're going to be using some shared logic or shared data in between all those different values. For example, here we could pass in a list of all of our books if that's what we wanted to do. So having that access be shared across all these components is, again, something that's incredibly useful. So I can come in here, I can just say like object.hello, and this should print out world. So if we go to book 1, you can see it prints out that text world, which is being passed down through that outlet context. Now, another thing that you can do with routes is you can actually have multiple routes in your application. You don't need to have just one route. You can use multiple, which is sometimes really useful if you want to show extra content based on a route that is different from like your main content. So let's just copy all of this route information. I'm going to put it above the nav bar so we can see the difference between these sections. And inside of here, I'm just going to have one single route, and this route is going to be for /books. And I'm going to render out just some random content. We're just going to say here is an H1 that says extra content, and we'll close that H1 off. So now anytime that we render that books path, what's going to happen is it's going to render out this extra content up here, as well as rendering out this book section here, which has whatever our current page is. So let me just save this real quick, refresh over here, click on our book list, and now you can see it's showing the extra content as well as this book list section because it's matching this route in both of our different routes. Now this is really useful, like I said, where you have like a sidebar, and the sidebar shows the same thing on most pages, but on some pages it might be different. You can define different routes for that so that by default it's going to show, your standard content, but on like the books page it's going to show different content, or on like the home page it'll show different content. That's again a really useful use case for these two different types of routes. Another thing that you can do when you have multiple routes is you can hard code a location. This location is just going to be a URL, so we could say like /books. And now it doesn't matter what URL I go to. By hard coding my location like this route is always going to use that location. So even when I'm on the home page, it still shows the extra content because we've hard coded our location to be /books. So that's why it's always rendering this /books route. This again can be useful if you need to show specific content when a specific location is showing and you want to make sure that you hard code that location in for specific use cases. Again, it's not something you use all the time, but it's nice to know it exists. Now, another thing you can do, we'll just remove this for now, is you can actually nest routes inside of other routes because let's say our application was really big, we had lots of pages, it probably doesn't necessarily make sense to define all of our routes in one location. What if we want to separate out our book routes into a different route of its own? What we can do is we can create a new page. We'll just call this book routes.js, export function book routes. This is just going to be, a normal React function. And inside of here, I want to return my own routes. So we're going to say routes, import that. And inside of here, I want to just copy over those routes that I had. So we're just going to copy this down into that book routes. Give that a quick save. There we go. So now we have our routes defined here. So in order to nest those routes, what we need to do is go back to this route where we have our books being defined. And instead of rendering out this book layout, we're going to render out that book routes component. So now we're rendering out those new routes. So we kind of have two routes nested inside of each other. But the key here is when you have one route that's just rendering out a bunch of other routes, you need to make sure that your path has a /* at the end of it. And the reason for that is because you want to make sure you match anything that comes after. So this route right here is going to match anything that starts with /books. Now, if I give this a quick save, we're getting a couple errors here. Let me just make sure that we fix this by importing route into here. And we also need to import our book routes as well. There we go. And we need to import our book, all this content. There we go. So let's put that into our book routes here. There we go. That's working. Okay. So now let's say that we go to the books page. You can see it renders out my book list, but it's not rendering out that navigation because we're no longer rendering our book layout. The best way to get around this is just at the top here to render out that book layout. So we can just render our book layout here, put these inside of fragments. And this is technically not rendering out any information. The reason for that is if we go back into this book here, this is expecting that outlet context, but we no longer have an outlet anymore because our book layout right here, whoops, if I go to my book routes, this book layout is just rendering right here. So we don't actually have that outlet context stuff anymore. So that's the reason why that was giving an error. So now we'll fix that, get rid of this object section here. There we go. We got book 1, book 2, and new book. All of those are rendering just fine. Same with this books page here. So this is an option for if you wanted to nest different routes together. The key is that you just need to put / with a star afterwards, and that'll make sure it matches any routes that come afterwards. And then inside of here, you could put, all your different routing information. If we wanted this to work like before, what we could do is we could just have a route that has an element on it, and our element could be that book layout, just like this, and then wrap this all in that route. And now we're going to have the best of both worlds where we have that book layout showing up as our root element. So they all share that. And if we went back into our book and just brought that context back into here, and I clicked on it, you can see it now gets that context being put in. So if you needed the context, this is one way to make sure you do that if you need to nest your routes as well. But again, this is entirely going to depend on your application needs. Now, the final thing I want to mention about setting up your routes is you don't actually have to set them up using JSX components like this. Instead, you can use a custom hook and define everything using JavaScript. So I'm just going to paste this in because I don't really want to type it all out. I'll explain what it is though. But essentially, we have this useRoutes hook. And this useRoutes hook, the way that it works is you just give it an array of objects. So this array right here, we have, for example, a path, which is the /. We have our element, which is our nav layout, and then we have our children. So you'll notice that all of the properties of these objects you pass into useRoutes are exactly the same as the properties you would pass to a route component. The only difference is that instead of using JSX to define everything, you're using JavaScript. So you see we have our children, which is an array. We have, that index property. We have our elements. We have our paths. We have our elements. We have paths. We have elements. All of that stuff is exactly the same. So if we wanted to, for example, define our home route, the way that would look is we would just do something like this. Get rid of all this children. We would have our element be home, and that would be how we define our home route. And then to use this, we would just, return our element like this. And this is going to be all of our different routes. And we could add in, for example, a not found route as well. And that would look something like this. Paste this down. This would be a star here. And this would say not found. So now if I comment out all of these routes and I save this, we currently have a home route and a not found route defined. So if we go to home, that works. But if we try to go to books, that route's not defined. So it's going to say not found. This is how you would define your routes if you wanted to do it using this useRoutes hook. It's entirely up to you which way you prefer. Personally, I like using the JSX way of doing things, so that is what I am going to do for the rest of this video, and that's the way that most people like to use this. And that right there covers essentially everything you need to know about the routing portion of React Router. So this is for setting up all of your different routes. Now the next thing I want to talk about is navigation. So this is going to be things like your link tags, as well as how to navigate without using link tags. Luckily, this is quite a bit simpler than the routing stuff we talked about, so it shouldn't be quite as confusing. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the actual link tags themselves, because they can have more properties than just the to property. The main properties are the replace property. If you say that this link is going to replace the previous link, what that means is that when you click the back button in your browser, instead of going back to the previous page, it'll go back 2 pages because this is replacing the link. So instead of actually going back to that page you used to be on, it's no longer going to be in the history. Let me show you what I'm talking about. We're currently on book 1, and then we're going to go to book 2. And now I'm going to click on the home page, which is set to replace. So now we just replaced book 2 in our history with the home page. So when I click back, instead of going to book 2, I actually go to book 1. Now, if I don't use replace on this, and I go back to how I was, and I go from book 1 to book 2, back to home, and then I go click the back button, you can see it brings me back to book 2. So the difference between replace and not replace is if you have replace, it just completely removes the page you're currently on from the history. So when you click back, you don't go to that page, but you go to the page before that one. This is really only useful in specific situations where, like, let's say you're on a login page and you log the user in and redirect them to a new page. If they click back, you probably don't want to bring them back to the login page because they're already logged in. So you would maybe in that scenario use the replace property. Another property you can pass in is the reload document property. This one's really straightforward. Whenever you click on a link that has that reload property, it's going to reload the entire page. So like I said, normally React Router is just going to change the content inside your route. But with reload document, it's going to reload the entire page and not just the section that's changing. So that's really all that reload document is going to do. And the final property I want to talk about is state, and this allows you to pass data along between one link and the other, but this data, it doesn't actually show up in the URL bar, and that's the real benefit of using this type of state, is it's not part of the URL. Now this is something I'm going to be talking a lot more about towards the end of this video when I'm talking about like state management and stuff like that, so we're going to just skip over the fact that this exists, but just know that you can do this with links and pretty much any other type of navigation. Now that's really all there is to this link component. It's really rather straightforward, but there's also another component that's very similar called the NavLink. And the NavLink works just like normal link. It has all of the same properties, but it allows you to do specific things with essentially the active state of a link. So it has a few additional properties. The first property that it has is class name, style, and the children property itself. These properties allow you to actually take in a function, and this function has the isActive class. So what we can do is we could say we want to do style, and I could come in here and I could pass this a function, and this function takes an object that is active. And this isActive is going to be true whenever we're currently on that link. So let's say that if it's active, I want to return some styling, and this styling is just going to say here, color red, and make sure I put that inside of an object, just like that, and we'll say return. There we go. So we're just returning the color of red if it is active. Let me just make sure is active, return that, otherwise return an empty object. There we go. So we're currently on the home page, so you can see our home link is set to red. When we go to this books route, you're going to notice the home link is no longer red. Super straightforward. That allows you to just kind of figure out which link is currently active, which is really useful. Now, this is something, like I said, you can do with style. You can also do with class names by setting class names based on if it's active, but you can also pass a function down as the child. So in here, what we could do is we could pass down a function, and this function is going to take that isActive property. And inside this function, we could just return, and if it is active, we could return the text active home. Otherwise, we'll just return the text home. So now, as you can see, when it's active, it has that active word in front, and when it's not, it does not have that active word. So those are 3 different ways you can play around with this isActive property. Another thing that's really nice about this isActive for the NavLink itself is that by default, if you don't want to do any of that, it'll apply a class of active. So if we actually just create a simple CSS style sheet, and we just say that anything that has an active class has a color of red, and we import that CSS, import styles.css, just like that, you can now see that our home link has been set to red because that's the active link. If I go to my books, you can see that that is now set to my active link. And when I click on book 1, you're going to notice my books is still set to an active link. All my books actually set this as an active link. The reason for that is because when you're matching a child route, for example, we have our main route here, and inside of this route, we have a bunch of children routes, these other routes. If the parent is being matched based on a child route, it still shows up as active. If you don't want that to happen, all you have to do is add a single prop that says end, and that's just going to make sure it only matches on the exact value of itself. So if I click on books, it's going to show up as red, but any of its children no longer make it show up as red. Now that's everything there is to the nav link and the link. And like I said, the nav link has all the same properties as link, so just you can use them both interchangeably. Essentially, nav link just gives you extra styling capabilities. Now there's another type of navigation you can do with components, and that is the navigate component. The navigate component essentially just, if you see that component, it'll automatically redirect you to another page immediately. So let's say instead of rendering out the text not found, if we go to the not found page, we want to redirect users back to the home page. To do that, I would use that navigate component that I was talking about. Whoops, navigate. And this navigate component works exactly the same as a link. It has the same props. As you can see, we have to, we have replace, and we have state. So I could say navigate us to the home page. So now if I go to a link that doesn't exist, for example, I just type in some bogus like this, hit enter, you can see it navigating me back to the home page. So this is really useful if you just want to automatically navigate someone whenever they reach a certain page. But what happens if you don't want to navigate them based on a component? Oftentimes you want to navigate people based on form submission. So like when they submit the login form, you want to navigate them to the page that they were trying to access by logging in. To do that, the best way to do it is going to be using the useNavigate hook. So let's import that useNavigate hook. This useNavigate hook is going to work really easily. So we're just going to come back in here. We're going to put that H1 back to where it was. We're going to say not found H1, close that off. And the way this useNavigate hook works is you can specify a location you want to go to as well as those replace and state properties, just like with everything else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say whenever you go to the not found page, so if we go to something bogus, what I want to do is after a set timeout of like 1 second, let's say, oops, 1 second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this useNavigate. And this useNavigate hook takes no properties at all, but it returns to us a function. Whoops, a function called navigate. Well, you can call it whatever you want, but generally navigate is the way to go. And this navigate function takes a to property, so we can navigate to the home page, and it takes options, and those options are our replace and state. All this different type of navigation, whether it's a link component, the navigate component, the useNavigate hook, they all generally take the same 3 things. We have our to property of where we're going to, we have the replace attribute, as well as our custom state that we can pass in. So I'm just going to do this navigate here. I'm going to make sure I'm going to put it inside of a use effect because that is the way you would do this inside of React. There we go. So now by calling this useNavigate hook, I've essentially given myself access to a function that allows me to navigate. And after 1 second, I'm going to redirect the user to the home page. So if we wait 1 second later, you can see it redirected us back to the home page. And this is kind of simulating what would happen if you submitted a form and needed to navigate someone to that new location. That's what this navigate function from the useNavigate hook is for. And this is 99% of the time how I do navigation. I almost never use the navigate component. Another really interesting thing you can do with this navigate is you can pass it a value. For example, I could pass it -1, and that's going to essentially simulate hitting the back button. So let's say that we go to our books page, and then I'm going to go to a brand new URL that's just bogus. So we'll just do this, hit it, and then it's going to go back immediately back to that books page after a little bit of time. So that's what you can do with like navigate -1. You could pass in here like -2 to go backwards 2 and so on. So you can pass in these values to go backwards or forwards however much you want, or you can pass in a hard-coded value if you, for example, just always want to go to the home page in this case. Now, the final thing I want to talk about when it comes to navigation is all of the different data you can store with navigation. We've already talked about this a little bit with the useParams hook. This useParams hook is data inside of the URL that we're able to access in our application. So when we click on book 1, it's getting that 1 from our URL. But there's more that we can do than just passing a value in the URL with our parameters. One of the things that we could do really easily is using search parameters. It's really common to have search parameters in your URL when you're doing things like filtering different books in a list. So in our book list, let's do exactly that. In our book list component, all right, we'll do it in our book layout, I guess. That'll work just fine. What we're going to do is we're going to have a single input, and this input is going to be type of number. There we go. And let's come in here. We'll make sure we set the value so this gets updated with React. We'll say set number e.target.value, and whoops, that is going to be our onChange, and then our value is just going to be equal to number. There we go, and we'll use state for that. So we'll say const number set number equals use state. There we go, and it's going to be an empty string to start with. Let's make sure we import that use state. There we go. So now we have this input that we can type any number that we want to into. And what we want to do is we want to show a brand new link for that number. So I'm just going to copy this code right here. And we're going to have a link that goes to this specific number. There we go. And then we'll put the number here. And let's default it to like 3. There we go. So now if I save, you can see we have a book 3 link. And as I change this, you can see that that link is updating. Well, what I want to do is I actually want to get this value from the search parameters of my URL instead of getting it from state. So to do that, we can use the use search params query, because that way when I refresh my page over here, it'll keep this value for our book that we're saving here. So if you're like filtering a list, this is really useful because you can save all your filter information in the query. And then if someone sends this URL to someone else, it's going to have the same filtering information. So with use search params, it works almost identical to how use state would work, but it's going to include everything that goes in your query param. So we're going to have just n, and we're going to set it to 3. That's going to be our default state. And we're going to here have our number and our set search params equals, and this right here is our search params. So we no longer need our number, and let's just do a quick console.log of our search params to see what this value is. Get rid of that use state, and we'll just save. We're going to have some errors, but hopefully if we just comment out the code that is using the number related information, we'll get rid of those errors, and now we can see what this value is returning. So if we look at our console, you can see we have URL search params, and inside of here we have a get function which we can pass in a value to get a specific value. So we could say .get n, and that is going to get us whatever we set as n. In our case, that is the value of 3, as you can see right here. So now what we can do is we can just say that const number equals search params .get n, and now anywhere we use number, that's going to work just fine. For example, like this, now our value is 3, and when we update our number, we just want to set our search params, and we want to set it to a value of n is our e.target.value. Now if I save and I change this value, you'll notice if you look up in my URL here, it now says $n equals 7. It's pulling that n value here from our search parameters, and every time I change it, it is updating in our URL. So if I refresh our page, you can see that this value right here is staying the same because it's stored inside of our URL. So anytime you're dealing with search parameters that you want to have in the URL, use this use search params hook. It's really easy to use. It works just like use state, and it allows you to essentially just replace use state with this use search params. Now, the final type of data that you can store that I want to talk about is going to be that special state variable that we've talked about but haven't really mentioned any depth of. Let's go back into here, and let's say that when we click on our home page, we want to store some state, and this state is just going to be an object. Actually, let's just make it a string that just says hi. So we are passing along the string hi anytime that we click on this home link. And I'll click on the home link. You'll notice nothing looks like it's been changed, but we have this hi information stored in our state. Now to get that state, we need to use the useLocation hook. And this useLocation hook gives us a location object. So let's just console.log what this location object looks like so we can see what's going on. If we inspect, we go to our console, we can see we get an object. It has a hash, a key, a path name, a search, and a state. So I'll explain what every single one of these properties is. Path name, that's really straightforward. That's essentially everything that comes after our localhost 3000. So if we're at the slash path, you can see we get slash. We click on books, you can see our path name is now slash books. This search section is essentially anything in our search query. So as I change this number here, and we open this up, you can see our search has that question mark n equals 10 section. That's just all of our search parameters that we've defined. Key, this is just a unique value that you can use anytime you need to like cache things related to a location. It's just a unique ID. That's all it is. Pretty straightforward. Hash, this is what happens if you put like the hashtag symbol and then you put like an ID afterwards, like test, hit enter. We go down to here. You can now see our hash is hash test. That's pretty straightforward. And then finally, we have our state section. So this is where you access your state. It's not stored anywhere except for inside of this use location hook. So when we go to our home page, you can see our state is set to high. And if we refresh, you can see if we open this up, our state is still set to high. It kind of persisted that state for us. So if we wanted, we could just render out that state on our page by just saying location.state. There we go. And now you can see that text high is showing up. So state is really good if you just need to pass information from one component to another, especially when you do like manual navigation. For example, on our not found page, when we navigate, we could pass along some state here. And our state will just say error not page. Sure, doesn't matter. And inside of here, we get rid of that. Yep, okay. Get rid of the state on our nav link here. And now what I do is I click on books, that works fine. Click on home, it works fine. But now let's say I navigate to a page that doesn't exist. It'll say not found. And then when it navigates me back, it'll give me that information. So if you need to show like a message, for example, based on where you previously were in an application, it's really easy to do this with state. State is just one of those things that you need to communicate between different pages, but you don't want it to be in your URL bar and you don't want it to be anywhere else. State is the way to do it. And that right there is everything you need to know about React Router. Now, if you want to take your React Hooks skills to the next level, I have a completely free React Hooks course linked down in the description. I highly recommend you check it out because it covers every single React hook that you need to know. And again, it's completely free. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.